The smell of hospital antiseptic never quite leaves you. Even now, months later, I catch it sometimes on my clothes or in my hair, and my stomach drops the same way it did the morning my grandmother died. I was sitting in the hospital waiting room when it happened, not because anyone called me, they didn't. I found out because her nurse, a quiet woman named Carol who had been caring for Gran for 3 weeks, slipped into the hallway and touched my arm. "She's gone, honey, I'm so sorry. I'd been there since 6 in the morning. My mother hadn't come at all. My aunt hadn't answered her phone. My grandmother raised me from age 7. After my parents' divorce turned both of them into strangers, who shared custody of their bitterness more than they ever shared me. I spent school nights at my mother's apartment and summers at Gran's house in Maplewood, a wide, cream-colored craftsman with a wraparound porch and a vegetable garden that my grandmother tended with the same patience she applied to everything in her life. I learned to read properly at her kitchen table. I learned that a handshake means something at her dining room table, watching her do business with local contractors who supplied her with custom furniture pieces she'd resell through a small but quietly lucrative antique and estate business she'd built over 40 years. She never talked about money. That was the thing. She drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard. She bought her clothes at the church thrift sale. When I was 17 and needed new textbooks for school, she handed me cash from an envelope in her desk drawer without blinking. But she never once mentioned the number in her bank accounts. I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know. The reading of the will happened 4 days after the funeral in the office of her attorney, a methodical and soft-spoken man I'll call Mr. Pratt. I arrived 15 minutes early. My mother arrived 10 minutes late, wearing sunglasses she didn't remove when she came inside. My aunt sat in the corner with her husband, both of them holding coffee cups like props in a performance. Neither of them had rehearsed enough. My cousin was there too, on his phone, leg bouncing under the table. Mr. Pratt began with formalities. He read slowly and precisely, the way lawyers do when they know the room is about to detonate. He reached the asset summary first. The business, Gran's estate sale and antique operation, valued at just under $1.2 million, including inventory and client contracts. Her house in Maplewood paid off, worth approximately $640,000 in the current market. Her investment portfolio, built quietly over decades in low-risk index funds she'd started contributing to in her 50s, valued at $2.9 million. A life insurance policy, a separate savings account. When he finished listing everything and gave a final total, my mother's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. $4.7 million. Then Mr. Pratt said the rest of it, to my granddaughter. And here he used my name. I leave the entirety of my estate, all assets, all holdings, all property, to be managed and disposed of at her sole discretion. My aunt's husband cleared his throat so loudly it sounded like a door slamming. "There must be a mistake," my mother said. Her voice was the careful voice she uses when she's performing calm. She's been practicing that voice my entire life. Mr. Pratt removed his glasses and set them on the folder in front of him. "There's no mistake. She was in poor health," my aunt said. "She didn't know what she was signing. Whatever she told you," she looked at me then, "whatever you told her to put in that document, we will contest it." I hadn't said a word since I sat down. "Gran was entirely of sound mind," Mr. Pratt said. Without changing his expression at all, she revised this will 14 months ago with full legal counsel, and she made a separate recording at that time which I'm prepared to show you. The recording was on a laptop. He turned to face us. My grandmother sat in a chair I recognized, the blue armchair from her study, with her hands folded in her lap and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, the way she always wore them when she was done reading for the day. She looked tired but precise. She knew what she was saying and she said it clearly. "If you're watching this," she began, "then something has surprised some of you." She talked for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the timer in the corner of the screen. She talked about her business, about the years she spent building it, about the decisions she'd made regarding each of her children and why. She mentioned specific incidents: a loan to my aunt and her husband in 2019, nearly $60,000, that was never repaid and never acknowledged again, another loan to my mother 2 years before that, for a business venture that lasted 7 months. She described asking for repayment once, gently, and being told she'd misremembered the agreement. She said she hadn't misremembered. She said she never misremembers money. She looked directly at the camera at one point and said, "My granddaughter is the only person in my family who ever asked how I was doing and waited for the actual answer." My mother left before the video finished. She stood up, pushed her chair back hard enough that it scraped against the floor, and walked out. My aunt stayed, rigid and pale. Her husband pulled out his phone. In the parking lot, they were waiting for me. My mother started before I reached my car. "You need to understand," she said, "that this is not legal. Whatever she thought she was doing, a will like this is not going to hold. She was not competent. We have documentation." "What documentation?" "What documentation?" I asked. My aunt stepped forward. "There are medical records, concerns that were raised by her doctor. I had been her emergency contact for 3 years. I had attended every appointment I could. No doctor had ever raised a concern about her competency to me or to anyone that I knew of. You will share that estate with your family," my mother said, and her voice had dropped into something quieter and more dangerous than her parking lot volume. "Or we will make this very difficult for you. We know people. We know attorneys." My cousin walked past me toward his car and said, without looking at me, "Don't be stupid about this." I drove to Gran's house because I didn't know where else to go. I still had a key. I'd had a key since I was 9 years old. The house felt different, empty, not abandoned. The garden was still in order because Gran had paid for a gardening service through the end of the year, a detail that made me cry in the kitchen for 10 minutes, but still, the absence was physical. I could feel it in the hallway where her coat always hung. I stood in her study for a long time without turning the lights on. On her desk was a note with my name on it in her handwriting. Not a long note. Just the bottom left drawer. The small key is in the blue teacup on the windowsill. The key opened a section of the drawer I hadn't noticed before, a false bottom lined with felt. Inside was a small accordion file, rubber banded shut. I sat in her desk chair and opened it. The first document was a letter from her attorney, dated 14 months ago, outlining the changes to her will and the reasons she had given. Stapled behind it were photocopies of loan agreements, not informal family lending, but actual signed documents she'd drawn up each time, with repayment terms and everything. Documents she'd apparently never shown anyone. Documents my mother and my aunt had signed and then presumably forgotten about or decided didn't matter. The total owed across both of them was just over $230,000. There was a folder labeled with my mother's name. Inside it was a record of every request she had made to my grandmother over the past 15 years, with amounts, dates, and whether the request had been fulfilled. It was meticulous. It was devastating. There was a folder with my aunt's name, same format. There was a third folder, thinner, labeled in Gran's handwriting with the word business. Inside was a letter from a client, one of her long-standing buyers, a woman who ran an estate auction house in the next county, describing an attempt by my cousin to contact her directly and offer to sell her several pieces from Gran's inventory at reduced prices. The contact had been made while Gran was in the hospital and still alive. My cousin had introduced himself as handling the estate. I sat with that folder open in my lap for a long time. My phone had 7 missed calls by the time I looked at it. 3 from my mother, 2 from my aunt, 1 from my cousin, 1 from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be my aunt's attorney, who had apparently been retained within 4 hours of the will reading. I called Mr. Pratt. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting my call. I told him what I'd found. He wasn't surprised. He said my grandmother had told him the drawer existed and that she expected I would find it in time. He said she had also retained a forensic accountant to document the full history of financial transactions between herself and her children, and that this documentation was already in his possession. He said she had been thorough. "I know," I said. "There's something else," he said. "She set up a separate trust before she revised the main will. It's for the business specifically, structured so that the inventory, the client relationships, and the operational accounts transfer to you without going through probate. Even if your family files to contest the will, the business is protected separately." I exhaled slowly into the phone. "She knew they would contest it," I said. "She anticipated every move," he said. "She asked me to tell you that." I stayed at Gran's house that night. I slept in the blue armchair in her study, the same one she'd sat in for the video, with her reading glasses on the side table and her handwriting on the note still folded in my pocket. The contest filing came within the week. My aunt's attorney argued diminished capacity, The documentation they submitted included a note from a general practitioner about Gran's declining energy levels in her final months, a note that described fatigue and some memory difficulty consistent with her illness, not cognitive impairment, not incapacity. Mr. Bering, Pratt filed a response within 48 hours that included the forensic accounting, the signed loan documents, the recorded will statement, a letter from Gran's specialist who had evaluated her cognitive functions 6 months before her death and found it entirely intact, and a sworn statement from Carol, the nurse who had been with her at the end, describing my grandmother as sharp, communicative, and specific about her wishes right up until her final week. My mother called me during this period every few days. The calls followed a pattern. First, the soft version. "Honey, this isn't about the money, it's about fairness. Your grandmother would have wanted us to be a family." Then, when I didn't respond the way she wanted, the harder version, "You are being manipulated by that attorney. You are throwing your family away over money. You will regret this." I stopped answering after the third call. I texted her once to say that any further communication should go through Mr. Pratt's office. My cousin showed up at the house. I had changed the locks by then. Mr. Pratt had advised it, but he rang the doorbell and stood on the porch, and I watched him through the front window for a moment before I opened the door. He looked different than he had in the attorney's office. "Less rehearsed, I just want to talk," he said. I waited. "I didn't know she'd kept all of that," he said, meaning the records, meaning the letter from the auction house client. "I didn't know she knew." "She always knew," I said. "That was kind of her whole thing." He stood there with his hands in his pockets. I waited to feel something that would tell me what to do. I felt tired, mostly. "I can't undo it," he said. "No," I said. He left. The contested will hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the business continued operating. The trust structure Gran had put in place meant that client sales, auctions, and inventory management were legally clear for me to continue. I hired Gran's longtime assistant, a steady and organized woman who had worked with her for 11 years and knew the operation better than I did, to help me manage the transition. I also hired an independent estate appraiser to document every item in the house. I did this because Mr. Pratt suggested it. I did it also because I knew what my family was capable of, and I was not going to discover later that anything had gone missing. The appraisal turned up something I hadn't known about. In a climate-controlled storage unit Gran had rented across town, there were 43 pieces of furniture and decorative art she had been holding for long-term appreciation, items she bought at estate sales in the 90s and early 2000s that had increased significantly in value. The appraiser estimated the collection at somewhere between $800,000 and $1.1 million depending on auction conditions. My mother had never known this storage unit existed. I thought about calling her to tell her, not to gloat, just because I thought for a moment that she might understand something if she knew. That Gran had been careful. That Gran had been building something for decades, quietly and precisely, and that none of them had ever bothered to look. I didn't call her. The hearing came on a gray morning in November. The courthouse smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. My mother and my aunt sat on one side with their respective attorneys. I sat with Mr. Pratt on the other side, with the forensic accounting binders on the table and the loan documents in a folder with numbered exhibits. The judge was a woman in her 60s who read everything before the hearing started and asked very specific questions. She asked my aunt's attorney to explain the basis for the diminished capacity claim. He presented the GP's note. She read it twice, then set it down and looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that didn't require translation. She asked about the loan documents. My mother's attorney tried to characterize them as informal family arrangements. The judge pointed out that they were signed and notarized. He tried again. She moved on. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The judge recessed for 20 minutes, came back, and ruled. The will stands. My mother didn't react visibly. My aunt put her hand over her mouth. My cousin, who had come and sat in the gallery without being on either side, looked at the floor. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Pratt shook my hand. I stood on the steps in the November air and felt the cold on my face and thought about Gran in her blue armchair telling a camera exactly what she wanted to happen and trusting that I would find the key in the blue teacup. The months after were quieter than I expected. My mother called once, 3 weeks after the ruling. The soft voice was entirely gone. She said that I had chosen an attorney over my family and that I would understand someday what I had lost. I listened until she finished. I told her I hoped she was okay. I told her I'd be in touch if anything changed. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand for a while. My aunt sent a letter through her attorney requesting a personal item, a photograph of my grandmother and my aunt as children that had hung in Gran's hallway. I had Mr. Chamber Pratt respond that I would need a full list of requested personal items in writing and that I would consider each one individually. The photograph was on the list. I had it copied at a print shop, sent the copy, and kept the original. My cousin texted twice, short messages, not asking for anything, just checking in. I responded briefly both times. I don't know what to do with him yet. That's still unresolved in a way that the legal part isn't. Gran's business is still running. We completed the holiday estate sale season with the highest revenue in the operation's recorded history, which I know because Gran kept every record going back 22 years. I've expanded the online auction side, which she'd been curious about but hadn't had the energy to develop in her final year. Her longtime assistant has become indispensable. I call her by her first name. She calls me by mine. We drink coffee at Gran's kitchen table on Wednesday mornings and go over the week's inventory, and sometimes we don't talk about work at all. She tells me things about my grandmother I didn't know. Funny things, small things, the kind of details that don't make it into wills or legal proceedings. I still live partly between Gran's house and my apartment. I'm not sure which is home yet. The garden is coming back in spring. I've been learning which of Gran's plants need what. Reading her handwritten garden journal the way you'd read a field guide. She annotated everything. Of course she did. I think about the day of the will reading sometimes. The scrape of my mother's chair on the floor. Mr. Pratt not changing his expression. The 11 minutes of Gran on that screen, saying the things she needed to say to a camera, because she knew she might not have the chance to say them otherwise. She knew they would contest it. She prepared anyway. She prepared everything. There's a line in one of her business journals from the early 90s when she was building the company through a rough market. The people who build things have to be willing to protect them. Otherwise, the people who don't build anything will always find a way to take what isn't theirs. I wrote it on a card and taped it to the desk in her study, my desk now. Some days that still surprises me. Most days it just feels like where I'm supposed to be. I've thought a lot about what my grandmother actually left me. Not the house, not the investment accounts, not the storage unit full of furniture that had been quietly appreciating for 20 years while nobody in my family bothered to ask her how her week was going. Those things are real, and I'm not going to pretend they don't matter. But the thing I keep coming back to is the accordion file in the false bottom drawer. The blue teacup with the key in it, the 11-minute video she recorded in her blue armchair, looking directly at the camera, saying what she needed to say because she knew, she had always known, exactly what was coming. She didn't leave me money because she loved me more. She left me everything because she had watched, for years, what the people around her did with trust when they thought no one was paying attention. And she was always paying attention. That was her whole thing. What I've come to understand is that the way you treat people when nothing is on the line tells you everything about what they'll do when something is. My mother and my aunt didn't become different people the day that will was read. They had always been those people. Gran just had the receipts. I think about that a lot when I'm at her desk now. My desk. Going through client records or reviewing inventory or just sitting with a cup of coffee in the morning before the day starts. She built something real over 40 years. Not because she was brilliant in some exceptional, unreachable way, but because she was consistent. She showed up. She kept records. She honored agreements. She noticed when other people didn't, and she adjusted accordingly without making a scene about it. She didn't cut my mother off or my aunt off or my cousin off. She just stopped extending trust that wasn't being returned quietly, and she documented everything. That's the part I keep returning to, the discipline of it. The patience, not bitterness. She wasn't bitter, I would have known, but clear-eyed, steady, unglamorous diligence. She knew that the work of protecting what you build isn't dramatic. It's just work. It's showing up for the hard conversation with the attorney. It's keeping the signed loan documents in a place where they can be found. It's recording a video you hope someone will actually watch. I don't know what my relationship with my mother looks like from here. I genuinely don't. Some days I think there's a version of things where we find our way back to something. Most days I think the distance is just the honest shape of what we actually are to each other. Now that there's no pretending otherwise, what I know is this. The people who tried to take what Gran built didn't fail because the judge ruled against them, or because Mr. Pratt had better paperwork. Though both of those things were true, they failed because they had spent years making choices that left them with nothing real to stand on when it counted. Every unreturned loan, every signed document ignored, every time my cousin called a client while Gran was still in the hospital, those weren't just bad decisions in isolation, they were a pattern, and patterns have weight. Gran understood that. She built her whole life on the understanding that what you do consistently, in the small moments when nothing feels like it matters, is exactly what determines what you have left when something finally does. I am still learning that. I'm 31 years old and I'm learning to tend a garden from a journal and run a business from a woman who kept records going back 22 years and thought to leave a key in a blue teacup just in case. That's the inheritance that actually matters. Everything else is just the proof that she meant it.